Right. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us today. This is an exciting and important conversation. Exciting because we have a truly amazing lineup, as you will see very soon. An amazing lineup of speakers, thinkers, and activists. Important because it is taking place this week, which marks the counter mobilization to transform corporate food systems, which is basically the counter summit to the United Nations Food Systems Summit. And among other things, this week we're protesting and confronting the growing so-called multi-stakeholderism, and we're defending multilateralism. We're also protesting and rejecting industrial food systems and increasing corporate control of food chains, which are responsible for existential threats, to our populations and of course to our planet and our people, including the climate crisis, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, water pollution, and countless human rights violations, including the continuing exploitation of women's paid and unpaid labor, the denial of our rights to land and natural resources, despite our central role in producing food all over the world. So in this session, we will be exploring feminist alternatives to break away from the extractivist and exploitative global economic system that we are locked in and that we know is failing. And we're doing the full recognition that feminist economic alternatives are diverse and they are context specific, so fully recognize that, but also with the knowledge that feminist alternatives are rooted in the principles and values of care for all life forms, centering care in the economy and society, the promotion of the autonomy and leadership of women and excluded people, and the key tenets of cooperation and solidarity, democracy and pluralism, the valuing of local knowledge, and complete freedom from violence of any form, including gender-based violence. So my name is Wangari Kinoti. I am a Pan-Africanist and feminist activist, currently working with ActionAid International, and I have the honor of moderating this discussion today. And so we'll move quite quickly to hearing from our amazing lineup of speakers, and I will introduce each speaker as they're about to come on. So to begin, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, who is a dear sister and friend by the name of Ruth Nyambura. And Nyambura is a Kenyan feminist and organizer whose research interests are primarily on the agrarian political economy and ecology in Africa, as well as other parts of the global south. She has worked as the head of advocacy for the African Biodiversity Network, which is one of the founding members and initial host of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. Nyambura has written extensively on various aspects of the current agrarian transformations in Africa, with her overall work focusing on the ideological underpinnings of the new green revolution in Africa and its ties to philanthro-capitalist organizations such as the Gates Foundation and the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. Her research also analyzes the rapidly changing policy and legislative frameworks across the continent related to biosafety and trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, the TRIPS regime, which are not only criminalizing the rights of smallholder peasant farmers to use their traditional and indigenous seeds, but are also opening up the space for foreign agribusiness companies on the continent and elsewhere. Ruth is part of the Nobre in Africa collective, which challenges forest-related carbon markets and documents the impact of these schemes on local communities in Africa. Nyambura is the founder of and convenes the African Ecofeminists Collective, and is also a board member of the Climate Justice Fund and the Blue Planet Project. She holds a master's in law in comparative law, economics, and finance from the University of Turin in Italy, and has been a judge on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. So over to you, Nyambura, to open the session for us.
Hi, Wangari. It's really nice to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm sitting on the wrong side of the office. So if my light is a bit distorted, I apologize for that, but I didn't have enough time to rearrange the space immediately. So I'll start very quickly, beginning with this conversation. And it's often a very broad conversation. And as you said, Wangari, it's such a context-specific conversation, right? But I always start from the point of another world is possible, and the minimum non-negotiables of we're fighting for food sovereignty, we're fighting for climate justice. So with that being the North Star, I begin my presentation. So I'm going to speak about feminist alternatives to the present crisis that we find ourselves in, or the norm, the hegemonical norm that we find ourselves in. But I'm going to concentrate on the continent of Africa, of course, referring to other parts of the world. But for this presentation, I'm going to limit myself to the context of the continent in which we find ourselves with regard to food and climate and agrarian questions. So in countries south of the Sahara in Africa, agriculture is a mainstay of approximately 60% of the population and contributing on average and upwards of approximately 15% of the total GDP. Countries such as Chad in Central Africa, for example, agriculture accounts for 50% of the GDP. This highlights just how important economically agriculture remains for very many African countries. Agriculture employs more than half of the total labor force on the continent, with the rural population, and providing a livelihood for multitudes of small-scale producers. Smallholder farmers on the continent, or what we'd call in terms of other terminologies, peasant farmers, constitute approximately 80% of all farms in countries south of the Sahara, and a majority of smallholder farmers or farms on the continent are basically 2 hectares or less and employ about 175 million people directly. And in many countries, women comprise at least half of the labor force in agriculture when you take into account, of course, a different, when you look at the full picture in North Africa, for example, Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, the numbers vary, but in general, women comprise at least half of the agricultural labor force on this continent. And despite the centrality of agriculture, at least economically, to both African farmers and governments, about a quarter of the population on this continent, something like 225 or 250 million Africans, are shockingly severely food insecure. And I'll say that again, despite the centrality of agriculture on this continent, about a quarter of the population, around 250 million Africans, are severely food insecure. African women in particular, who represent the majority of the poorest, and specifically African women living in rural areas, bear the greatest brunt of food insecurity, as they, together with their children, make up the majority of the chronically hungry on the continent, despite being significant food producers themselves, if not the primary food producers on the continent. And of course, globally, we know that women make up 60% of the chronically hungry, of course, in spite of their central role. And when you look at it from a feminist perspective, it is important to take into account the gender dimensions of the causes and impacts of food insecurity and hunger, especially the distinct gender-based differences among the social groups that are most affected. So hunger doesn't happen in a vacuum, doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? So in Africa, women are the majority of those living in poverty. They are disproportionately represented in the care economy, and by extension, their full contributions to the economy are never properly accounted for, as they are routinely diminished and invisibilized under gender-blind economic indicators. In addition to this, and this really speaks to the heart in terms of what are feminist alternatives when it comes to the economy? So the problematic focus on GDP growth as a sole indicator of a nation's well-being has led to a crisis that manifests itself in the form of a lack of in-depth interrogation as to how gender and women's instrumentalization in mainstream development and economic processes, coupled with geographical and environmental inequalities, continue to provide vicious incentives for economic growth, as well as for the growing rates of hunger and malnutrition. And the pervasive silences or distortions within mainstream economics over this issue is quite shocking, given that in this particular period of time, we're witnessing a convergence of multiple crises: food, energy, climate, growing authoritarianisms, and fascism, to name just a few. This is in addition to the seemingly lack of political will to confront these and other pressing, intersecting ecological concerns, which are highly classed, racialized, and gendered, even on this particular continent. So to think about, to think about to go in depth into particular issues, right? So as I said, hunger and food insecurity do not happen in a vacuum. Since the oil crisis of the 1970s and the advent of structural adjustment programs on the continent, not just on the continent, but structural adjustment programs pushed across the global south. And we know that on the continent of Africa, witnessed some of the most severest structural adjustment programs, policies being pushed. So for example, the dismantling of marketing boards, the dismantling of, guaranteed prices for farm produce, because before structural adjustment programs across the continent, farmers used to have at least guaranteed prices for farm produce. So this was dismantled in addition to, extension services. And we can see this in the, in the defunding of the public sector, the rolling back of the public sector, as it's called, and the pushing forward of the private sector. But even the pushing forward of the private sector really relied on the state being a guarantor and an insurer of the private sector as it relates to agriculture. And in the 1960s, we'd see that Africa as a continent, was a net food exporter. But by the time the structural adjustment programs were hitting in the 1970s, in the 1980s, up to date, we see that the continent is a net food importer. And to open that can even further, this particular period of time has pushed particular policies that we see themselves manifesting to where we are at this present moment. So for example, legislation that moves from, international negotiations around trade, and trade remains very central in terms of the ways in which, agriculture, food security, becomes very problematic in the global south. So we see, for example, in the World Trade Organization, the introduction of strong intellectual property rights around seeds, for example, right? So we've seen, and in the last decade, we've seen African governments pushing for strong intellectual property rights, not just within specific countries, but within, regional economic commissions such as COMESA, which is a common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or the East African Community, the EAC. So pushing for legislation which basically criminalizes the rights of smallholder farmers or peasant farmers to save, sell, and exchange their seeds. And when you have that situation, it means that you're opening the door basically for corporate and industrial agriculture to flood the markets on the continent. And because of the economies of scale and even the procedures that are required, to certify, the process of certification, which are basically European models or Western models being imposed on, on the global south, or being imposed on the continent. And, the agricultural context is so different, vastly different from what it is in the global north and what it is in the global south. Even within the global north, the agricultural sector is not the same as we like to imagine it. So this legislation is being pushed, and you can see that this is something that has been happening in the last decade, with the structural adjustment programs and how the space was opened up for corporate control of agriculture. At the same time, we've seen the so-called, what is being called the second land rush, beginning 2004, where more foreign direct investment in land across the continent, but especially heavily concentrated in countries such as Sudan, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Madagascar, where vast, literally millions of hectares of land, being bought up by private equity funds based in Singapore, California, the Silicon Valley, in London and Hong Kong and whatnot, and Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, so you have all this land being bought, or being leased, to farm for food, biofuels, cash crops, with detrimental effects to pastoralists, indigenous peoples, fisher folk, women, So this has been the situation, and you can see that, this has also increased the levels of food insecurity, and also increased the level of corporatization of food and the agrarian politics on the continent. And of course, what we've seen with this particular type of agrarian transformation that is being pushed, not just within the last 40 years, but also the ideological underpinnings of it within this period of neoliberal politics, an agricultural or an agrarian transformation very myopically centered on increasing yields alone, but very little respect to, what kinds of technologies, markets, resource use, and ownership rights are necessary for the kinds of context we find ourselves in, and importantly, what even kind of an agrarian transformation does the continent need? And more so for smallholder farmers, for pastoralists, for fisherfolk, who not only feed this continent, but also because of their agricultural practices, whether it's agroecology or whatever it is, which works in harmony with nature. And in addition to that, we do know that we are presently facing a climate crisis. Up to 95% of African agriculture relies on rain, is basically rain-fed. And so with the climate crisis that we are facing, with a continent that has produced the least amount of emissions, but is presently suffering the most severe impacts of the crisis, and will continue to face the most severe impacts of the crisis, we are seeing that, in as much as there's an explicit recognition of the historical responsibilities of the global north with regard to emissions, yet the policies being pushed continuing the same neoliberal capitalist trajectory, or they're pushing for techno fixes such as genetically modified foods, pushing for geoengineering technologies or carbon markets, which basically purport to solve the climate crisis from the same structures that created the climate crisis. So this basically forms the particular kind of context that we find ourselves in with regard to food, with regard to the climate crisis and the environmental crisis that we presently face. And so I'll move on to what does, with that in mind, what exactly does a feminist alternative look like? As I started, I said that what has been very clear for feminists is that the kind of economic trajectory, the capitalist economic model provides vicious incentives for the kinds of inequalities, exclusions, and marginalizations that women in their diversity continue to face. So to begin with, capitalism cannot get us out of this situation. As I've spoken about how even within the climate discussions, the same policies around whether it's techno fixes or genetically modified foods, have been unable to get us out of the food crisis, the environmental and the climate crisis, and even the gender crisis the patriarchal crisis that we presently face. So it's very clear that capitalism will not get us out of this situation. It will continue to be the externalizing machine of capitalism that continues to oppress and marginalizes, will continue if we don't get out of that particular system. That is very important to keep in mind when we think about what a feminist economic alternative is. Capitalism is not an alternative. We cannot continue on the same trajectory unless we're saying as feminists that we need to continue in a trajectory in which it is okay for others to be oppressed as others go up the ladder. So that is the first thing to keep in mind. It's important to keep in mind when we talk about what are the alternatives are. We need to think very clearly about what are the kinds of trade practices and politics that we want to think about. We all know very well that within the World Trade Organization negotiations, that agriculture has been one, if not the most contentious discussion within the World Trade Organization. What does it mean when African farmers, African governments cannot subsidize smallholder farmers, cannot subsidize their farmers, yet Western governments are not only able to subsidize their farmers, right, but are able to basically able to punish, African governments of governments in the global South for subsidizing, and putting in place measures that will, basically support the kinds of initiatives that the farmers in the country are pushing, but also to address and redress the climate crisis. So it's important for us to really challenge the trade models and the trade system as we know it. It's a model that cannot continue. Africa, when you talk about the fact that, when you think about the long histories of colonization, even the agricultural model that we find ourselves in with regard to to particular cash crops, Africa continues to use vast amount of land, to grow cash crops for export at the expense of food crops. And this is a continuation of basically colonial policies that still manifests itself within global trade policies. So it's important to dismantle this particular forms of trade policies, right? And to put in place measures in particular trade policies in which African farmers, are at the center, right? And to also push in place measures when it comes to the climate crisis. And you see within the present negotiations, as I said, that admitting historical responsibility is not enough, right? What's needed is reparations for the emissions. Climate reparations are absolutely necessary. Pushing for a mechanism in which, necessary technologies are shared, minus intellectual, the constraints of intellectual property rights, pushing for serious adaptation and mitigation measures that don't rely on fake and false techno fixes that basically benefit consultants working in private equity firms in the global north, and also benefiting, polluting corporations, but technologies that actually are centered on, work together with people, but also in nature. We've seen agroecology works, and it's very incredible that agroecology is called an alternative. And even I was really thinking about the question of what are feminist alternatives? Because one of the things is that a lot of the things that we call alternatives have actually been the norm. Industrial agriculture, pollution that we have from, fossil fuel extraction, these are actually, these are the things that came to destroy what is actually the norm. So even the language of alternatives, what do we say when we talk about, African women saving their seeds for generations and passing on the knowledge from generation? This has been the norm for generations. It is, it is extractivism. It is the trade policies. It is the techno fixes that actually have come to destroy what has always been the norm. And it is that which is being pushed as the alternative. So it's important also to think about a battle of narratives in terms of what our alternatives are. So it is important also, in addition to that, to say that we have to move away from extractivism and extraction. This is absolutely important. We cannot continue with business as usual for as long as we continue to extract fossil fuels, especially the global north continues to extract fossil fuels. Food sovereignty, agroecology, climate justice, environmental justice will continue to remain a myth. These are not, the question of food sovereignty, food justice, environmental justice, these are not just local solutions. We can't lock ourselves in as a continent or lock ourselves in as farmers from one district in some part of Kenya and say that we're going to practice agroecology, we are going to work in harmony with nature, we're going to do ABCD. It's not, because the crisis we face, this is an international crisis. It goes beyond the local sphere, a regional sphere. It becomes not just a national crisis, but an international crisis. And that means that the solutions that we push forward, while local solutions, regional solutions, and national solutions are definitely important, without a well-mounted grassroots movement that moves towards an internationalist politics, of centering those on the front lines of the climate crisis, those on the front lines of the food crisis, but also centering, what, again, I'll use the term with my own caution, what we call, when we talk about, a different knowledge, the women's knowledge or feminist knowledge, right? Without that centering, then we remain at the same space we find ourselves in. It's sort of a circle we go back to. So these are the things that are important to think about in terms of what the alternatives are. look to the heart of trade policies, look to the heart of what the kinds of technological developments that are being pushed around food, around agriculture, but also think about the capitalist economic system. We cannot solve this crisis from the same space that we find ourselves in. And I don't know how much time I have left, but I will.
A couple of minutes, but there'll also be a chance for you to say more
Yes.
later on. So
I have a bit more to say, but I will.
You can.
Okay. Do I continue?
Yeah.
Or do I go back to it?
I think you can probably pause for now, and then we can hear from the discussants, and we can sort of come back to you to share the rest of your reflections. But thanks so much, Nyambura, for really starting us off on this really important foot. And I've been furiously taking notes from what you've been saying, and I won't repeat what you've said. There will be a chance for our discussants to sort of reflect on that while giving their own reflections on the topic. But I think, one of the things that I think was really important that you're reminding us is around what our narratives around alternatives, and the fact that, what we now sort of consider the norm, which is, sort of what has been basically pushed down our throats by neoliberalism, by capitalism, and so on, is actually came to destroy what was actually the norm in generations past. And you say that, for example, around local knowledge, around seeds, around agroecology. And I would say, as what we're now sort of saying is an alternative around centering care in economies. I would argue that our traditional communities did center care in the way that in the way that we organize and so on. And we can talk about that for a long time. But thank you so much. You have given us a lot to reflect on, and I will invite now to respond to you and to share her own reflections. I'll start with Miriam Nobre, who is an agronomist and a feminist activist with the World March of Women in Brazil. Also as part, and is also part of the feminist organization Sempre Viva Organização Feminista, where for the past few years she has carried out popular education, research, and technical advice activities on feminist and solidarity economies, agroecology, and food sovereignty, together with peasant and Afro-descendant women from Vale do Ribeira in Sao Paulo. And between 2006 to 2013, Miriam was the coordinator of the International Secretariat of the World March of Women and a member of the Nyeleni Forum for Food Sovereignty. I was asked by the interpreters to speak slower. I know I often speak fast, and I'll ask the rest of us as well to just try and speak slowly so that we're sure that everybody's understanding each other. But Miriam, welcome, and over to you.
Gracias. Buenos días a toda la gente aquí presente. Yo hablo desde Brasil, entonces el sol está naciendo, por eso va a ser bueno para las intérpretes. Estoy bien vagarosa. Mira, gracias por invitar a nosotras de la Marcha Mundial de las Mujeres. Somos compañeras con muchas de las organizaciones que están acá en el grupo de trabajo de mujeres del mecanismo de la sociedad civil, del Consejo de Seguridad Alimentaria. Y para nosotras de la marcha, la economía feminista es una herramienta muy importante porque localizamos la sostenibilidad de la vida como el principio que debe organizar a la economía. Y eso implica en una reorganización de la producción y de la reproducción social que está ocurriendo sí o sí, ¿no? Como Nyambura hablaba de las crisis, como es esta pandemia que estamos viviendo ahora del COVID, como son los cambios climáticos. Acá en Brasil en los últimos días solo que hacemos es compartir formas agroecológicas de nos preparar para una gran helada que no veíamos hace tiempo, pero también una crisis de los cuidados basados en la sobrecarga de las mujeres y tratados como una cuestión privada. Entonces, frente a esas crisis, hay un embate por soluciones conservadoras, como lo que vemos aquí en nuestro país con este gobierno Bolsonaro genocida y que impulsa a las mujeres a su único rol de madres, buenas madres y buenas esposas. Entonces, hay esta vertiente de la solución conservadora y hay las propuestas de crear, de hecho, un debate político en condiciones de igualdad y libertad para que podamos reorientar en un sentido de transformación de la sociedad, superando el capitalismo patriarcal, racista, colonialista que está hegemónico en nuestra sociedad hoy. Es hegemónico, pero no es todo. Entonces también desde las alternativas, nosotras nos inspiramos tanto de las comunidades tradicionales que resisten con otras prácticas económicas, pero también en aquellas prácticas económicas, políticas, organizativas que logramos hacer desde nuestra acción política, mismo que sean en algunos momentos de mayor confrontación política con el orden instituido. Y desde esta experiencia yo podría localizar algunos puntos para hacer la relación con el debate de soberanía alimentaria, de lo cual, claro, aprendemos muchísimo de nuestra alianza con la vía campesina. Yo quería rescatar unos 3 puntos. Uno tiene que ver cómo reconocer y valorizar a la producción de las mujeres en la agricultura, en la crianza de animales, en la recolección, como ya lo hacen hoy y como ya lo hacen en resistencia, no queriendo proponer nuevos proyectos y nuevas iniciativas a las mujeres, reconocer lo que ya hacen. Entonces, por ejemplo, una experiencia que tuvimos en el marco acá de las organizaciones que hacen parte del grupo de trabajo de mujeres de la Articulación Nacional de Agroecología. Incluso veo a mi compañera María Emilia, que como yo está madrugadora acá en esta sección. Pudimos con mujeres de todo el país hacer una experiencia de registrar el destino de su producción durante un año. Y con eso pudimos considerar el volumen, la cantidad de la producción de las mujeres para el autoconsumo, la troca y la donación. Con eso lo que quedó evidente a nosotras, no solo que la producción de las mujeres sostiene a sus familias, como que sostiene a sus familias ampliadas, incluso aquellas integrantes de las familias que están viviendo en la ciudad, pero también sostiene una especie de seguridad social comunitaria porque acoge a las vecinas que están en un momento de dificultad de producción y también sostienen a los servicios como son las guarderías y otros, frente a una reducción de aportes públicos del Estado. Y mismo la producción de las mujeres que se destina al mercado es un mercado de otro tipo, es un mercado de reciprocidad que reconoce este mercado de la venta de puerta a puerta, del local, de los circuitos locales, que acoge a la diversidad de las mujeres. Entonces, frente a esas grandes ideas de los camiones, de las toneladas de un mismo producto, las mujeres hacen una venta continua de productos diversos y que sí tienen un significado económico muy fuerte no solo para sus familias, como para sus comunidades y sus municipios. Eso de la diversidad es también un punto central de los conocimientos que las mujeres tienen en el quehacer de la agricultura. Eso ya desde Nelení habíamos apuntado. Reconocer la contribución de las mujeres por la cantidad, por el volumen de producción, pero también por los conocimientos que ellas tienen. Es una manera que por vez la llamamos de agroecología. Por ejemplo, las mujeres plantan mezclado, ¿no? Entonces con eso sí establecen una sinergia entre las plantas y conocen a esas sinergias, experimentan eso, y también como una compañera Vanilda, una agricultora quilombola afrodescendiente aquí del Valle, dijo que cuando se planta mezclado, cuando uno va a limpiar el terreno para entrar luz, para que otras plantas crezcan, no se sacan malas hierbas, siempre se saca la comida. No hay malas hierbas, hay matos de comer, como decimos aquí. Hierbas que se comen incluso con sabores y texturas que estamos perdiendo por una homogeneización de la alimentación. Y con eso también, eso de plantar mezclado, una compañera nuestra, Natalia Lobo, ha identificado que este hacer de la agroecología también es una manera de engañar a los algoritmos de la agricultura 4.0, que cree que puede organizar a todas las informaciones y saber más que el conocimiento de los agricultores, sobre todo de las agricultoras de las comunidades tradicionales. Eso porque las mujeres tienen una interrelación con la naturaleza que se expresa en una explicación que una agricultora Aparecida también me ha dicho. Ella me ha dicho, yo cuido de la planta, pero la planta cuida de mí. Entonces, las mujeres cuidan de su sitio y su sitio cuida de ellas. Eso del cuidado también es central, y aquí entro en una segunda idea que para nosotras de la marcha es muy importante. Estamos viendo cómo el cuidado se está organizando también desde las organizaciones sociales en alianza del pueblo del campo, de las mujeres trabajadoras en el campo, con el pueblo trabajador en la ciudad. Y eso se ha ampliado muchísimo en la pandemia, cuando la solidaridad de las organizaciones sociales está actuando muy fuertemente frente al aumento de la inseguridad alimentaria, con mucho más rapidez y con mucho más capilaridad que las acciones del Estado. Acá vimos, pero también en la marcha hicimos como un cierto inventario de lo que estaba pasando en otros países, y vimos que los colectivos que se organizan en la ciudad en torno a la donación, que sea la venta o la producción en nuestros huertos urbanos, todas esas iniciativas que visan aumentar el acceso a la comida buena en la periferia han aumentado muchísimo. Y con eso, juntos, fortalecemos nuestra salud, pero también rompemos la alimentación, rompemos la alienación sobre lo que comemos. Y eso haciendo frente a no solo la homogeneización de los productos ultraprocesados, pero esta distribución centralizada en los grandes supermercados. La idea es cómo podemos liberar también los territorios urbanos del control de las corporaciones sobre la alimentación. Vimos también que en los huertos urbanos las mujeres lo viven como un espacio también de reconstrucción, de regeneración. Vimos como mujeres que han perdido sus hijos para la violencia de la policía acá en las periferias, o las mujeres que están en situación de violencia, cuando se juntan para hacer huertos urbanos, en los tiempos de los crecimientos de las plantas también se rehacen y se retroalimentan. Por último, también quería rescatar como muy importante el preparo colectivo del alimento. Tenemos experiencias históricas acá de Perú, de Chile, de los comedores populares, pero también cómo se arman muy rápidamente estos espacios de preparo colectivo cuando se sostienen las revoltas populares, como lo vivimos en Argentina, pero ahora muy recién en Colombia. Entonces hay gente que nos preguntan, ustedes están reforzando el rol tradicional de las mujeres en la cocina. Y les respondemos que no, porque se produce el alimento no en el espacio privado, pero en el ámbito de una lucha, y se politiza eso, porque las formas organizativas, el hacer la comida, el plantar lo que se come, el llegar a organizar el acceso de la comida de las campesinas y los campesinos, es tan fuerte en la organización como preparar el discurso o responder a la prensa o pensar en la estrategia de la ocupación del espacio. Es otra forma de organización política que considera lo que es esencial a sostener la vida como parte fundamental de su organización. Y con eso termino, resgatando una palabra de orden que cantábamos acá cuando marchamos, cuando hicimos una marcha durante una acción internacional de la Marcha Mundial de las Mujeres. Decíamos, y siempre decimos, que la cocina es el corazón y sin comida no hay revolución. Gracias, compas.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And indeed, without food, there is no revolution. And thanks for all those wonderful examples that you've given, and reminding us that really at the heart of this is valuing and recognizing the diverse forms of women's sort of work and labor in terms of food systems, but also in the rest of the economy, including through their unpaid labor. So it's about valuing and replicating, this knowledge, which goes back as well to Nyambura's point around local knowledge systems, around narratives, about alternatives, which are really the ways that we were organizing before, and also ultimately reminding us that that sustainability of life really needs to be the organizing principles, or the organizing principle when it comes to our economies. I will now introduce our second discussant, who is Sonia Vidal. I saw you just put on your video. Welcome, Sonia. Sonia Vidal comes from the well-known to many of us, I'm sure, International Peasants Movement of La Via Campesina. Sonia is a livestock farmer in Ourense, in the Galicia region of Spain. Sonia is a mother of 2 girls and a member of the executive of the Sindicato Labrego Galego, which is the labor union in Galicia. And Sonia works with others to produce high quality meat while keeping the forests around the villages clean and working with the livestock to prevent forest fires. 50% of their production is sold to private individuals, and their meat goes from the slaughterhouse to the consumer without intermediaries or long distances. Sonia, over to you.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un placer para nosotros desde Vía Campesina poder participar en estos espacios. Pues bien, me voy a repetir un poco en este pequeño discurso en lo que han dicho las compañeras, ¿no? Porque soy con esta COVID-19 que ha dejado más claro los límites del sistema capitalista, de que no va a resolver los problemas fundamentales de la clase obrera y sobre todo de las agricultoras y agricultores. El capitalismo se ha convertido en un modo de producción del pasado, del atraso, porque realmente ya no significa la solución a los problemas de la gente. No es un modelo para el futuro y no tiene perspectivas como modelo. En ningún lugar del mundo, en Europa, ni en los Estados Unidos, ni en ningún otro lugar, el capitalismo no nos ha resuelto el problema del trabajo, y la mayoría de los países capitalistas la tasa de desempleo es del 40% o incluso mayor. El capitalismo no garantiza ni la vivienda, ni los ingresos, ni las escuelas, ni el transporte, y lo poco que existe en estas condiciones pues son insanas. En este momento de crisis que estamos atravesando, está agravando aún más el estado en que nos encontrábamos ya anteriormente las mujeres y el colectivo LGTBI. Los estados en esta situación de pandemia, en lugar de apoyar, regularizar y promover las pequeñas producciones, la agricultura familiar, que mayoritariamente está en manos de mujeres, ha vulnerado todavía más los derechos tanto de las mujeres como de las personas LGBTI. Y esto es un hecho a nivel mundial. Las mujeres son las que producen la mitad de los alimentos a nivel mundial, además de estar a cargo de los familiares dependientes y de los niños, ellas son las primeras víctimas de los sistemas patriarcales implantados en todos los países del mundo. El desarrollo de las producciones de alimentos tienen que estar basados en la agroecología. Son los productos agroecológicos los que se producen de una forma sostenible con el medio ambiente, y los productos agroecológicos son mucho más sanos para nuestra salud y para nuestro planeta. Producir basados en la agroecología no es más que seguir los pasos de nuestros ancestros. Se optimizan los recursos naturales, sobre todo de agua y de tierra. En su conjunto preservan la biodiversidad y aumentan la soberanía alimentaria. Los principios de la agroecología es conservar los recursos naturales, la utilización de renovables, pero ojo, el tema de las renovables en la región de Europa, por ejemplo, se está, y lo digo así de claro, prostituyendo, porque con esto de implantarnos la energía verde, están haciendo acaparación de tierras para plantarnos con la excusa de promover las energías renovables, pues ese acaparamiento de tierra que tan necesario es para las agricultoras y agricultores. Preservando todo eso, necesitamos incidir que no podemos preservarlo a cualquier precio, ¿vale? La minimización de productos tóxicos y el manejo adecuado de la biodiversidad, la maximización de los beneficios a largo plazo y un largo etcétera, es la agroecología. Con estos principios, lo que hacemos es aumentar la fertilidad de la tierra, protegernos de erosiones y protegernos ecológicamente de productos y de plagas. En este caso son las mujeres quienes tienen mayoritariamente este sistema de producción en sus manos. Es por ello que en muchas ocasiones son las llamadas guardianas de las semillas, porque son ellas las que llevan desde décadas guardando las semillas originales de nuestros pueblos, de nuestros territorios. Son esas semillas que son tan necesarias para producir alimentos saludables y que no estén basados en genéticamente modificados. Las mujeres cada vez están más visibles en espacios como pueden ser colegios, instituciones y puestos visibles donde reivindican unos precios justos para una alimentación saludable. Solo este modelo, basado en la soberanía alimentaria y la agroecología, puede garantizar una alimentación saludable. Mucha gente no sabe de dónde vienen los productos que comen y sobre todo cómo se producen. Y es por ello que las mujeres deben buscar el tiempo y la forma para poder estar tanto en las instituciones como en organizaciones para en los colegios dar esa formación y informar a la población de la alimentación. Y qué mejor que en este caso las propias productoras. Desde la Vía Campesina estamos trabajando en ello. Es nuestro principal reto ir mano a mano con nuestras organizaciones miembro para que las mujeres tomen más voz en estas instituciones, en todos los espacios posibles para poder dar esa visibilización desde las propias organizaciones, desde las propias productoras, así como sobre todo participar en espacios formales, como pueden ser pues, distintos grupos de negociación en los parlamentos, en los espacios de la FAO, que es tan importante, que estamos viendo ahora mismo cómo se va a activar esta cumbre de alimentación y quién está detrás y quién debería estar ahí con esa voz más potente, son sobre todo las mujeres y también los jóvenes que hacen esas producciones basadas en la agroecología, basadas en la agricultura familiar, sostenibles y claro, sobre todo basados en la soberanía alimentaria. debemos visibilizar esas alternativas de producción de los alimentos sanos. También para nosotros, como nombraba ahora, es un colectivo muy importante los jóvenes, porque al final son nuestro futuro, son los que deben continuar con nuestras luchas hacia una producción y alimentación saludable y sostenible en todos los aspectos. Y debemos ir formándoles tanto a ellos como buscar la forma de que nuestras mujeres tengan esa voz y puedan visibilizar todas las problemáticas que ellas tienen en sus granjas, en sus explotaciones, en su actividad de agricultura, para visibilizarlas y ver cómo podemos buscar esas soluciones para ello, porque muchas veces está en nuestras manos y tenemos las soluciones, lo que pasa es que no las estamos visibilizando cara a la población y sobre todo en las instituciones. Y bueno, estoy abierta a todas las preguntas, no voy a continuar, vamos a dejarlo ahí y estoy abierta a todas las preguntas que ustedes tengan. Y al igual que Miriam, voy a cerrarlo con nuestro lema: globalicemos la lucha, globalicemos la esperanza. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Localizing our knowledge, localizing our hope, reminding us again, as Nyambura has, as Miriam has, talking about going back to really the agroecological and biodiversity sustaining methods of our ancestors and community. A lot of that knowledge, the majority of that knowledge, which lies with women. And, again, saying to us, reminding us that, capitalism will not help us. Actually, it has not helped anyone, has not provided any solutions, and cannot be the model of the future. Please, thanks very much for everyone who is interacting on the chat. Thanks for sharing your resources and links to materials and so on. Please keep doing that. If there are questions, please use the Q&A section also at the bottom of the screen. We'll come back. We'll have a chance to come back to those questions in a short while. So please just do put those in the question and answer area. And if any of the members of the panel would like to respond in writing to the questions, please also do that in Q&A section, as we may not necessarily have too much time to address each question. But now, last but certainly not least, is our third discussant, Andrea Collins. Dr. Andrea Collins is Associate Professor in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo, and a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Her research focuses on gender, land, and food politics in the global political economy, and policy debates about women's rights and economic empowerment. Andrea, I know that you're particularly interested in the question of who benefits. So, comparing the corporate food system and its approach to gender equality. So inclusion in markets, access to technologies, and so on. So that approach, comparing that approach to the features of feminist economic alternatives. So do share your reflections on this with us.
Great, thank you for having me. And it's early here in Canada, and it's worth getting up for to hear all of the remarks from the fellow panelists and be part of this conversation. And before I go further, I just want to acknowledge first that I'm living on the Haldeman Tract, which was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River, who are Indigenous peoples in Canada, and it's the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I think it's important to recognize that we're grappling with the legacies of colonialism here in contemporary Canada, and there's no shortage of food sovereignty issues that go with that, and the threats of colonialism and industrial food systems here. But most of my remarks are about thinking about the the corporate global food system, and who benefits from that. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing with a lot of the debates that are going on as part of, you know, the UNFSS and the response to it is, you know, and we're hearing it from the other panelists this morning about, you know, what has capitalist corporate food systems done for people, and it's, you know, not much really, right? When we're thinking about who benefits from that. And a lot of the institutional discourses about this, you know, they say, you know, we can benefit gender equality through capitalist food systems. We just need to include women in these systems. And I think we can see from the legacy of what's happened is that just adding women to an unequal system doesn't change that system. It doesn't recognize the value of care work, which I think is a common thread from what we've heard from the panelists already this morning. It doesn't address the multiple labor burdens that women take on or are forced to take on in these systems. It doesn't challenge the gender binary or heterosexism or other kind of modes of oppression that exist. And it doesn't change the economic or political structures that have marginalized people all over the world. So I think it's really important, and this is my kind of academic perspective, but I think a key thing when we're thinking about the politics and the economics of things is who benefits from these systems. And I think it's, I don't want to repeat a lot of what's already been said because it's been said so well by the other panelists, like Ruth mentioned at the beginning about the effects of trade liberalization, intellectual property rights. We've seen these be implemented, and they don't benefit the people who are producing the food, who are feeding communities. And we know this from the research that, like, if we're thinking about, you know, who benefits from, say, trade liberalization, it's not small scale farmers, it's not peasants, it's not fisher folk, it's certainly not women who don't have access to the same resources to participate in, in trade, or have access to markets the way that other people do. As already been mentioned, you know, they're overrepresented in small scale and subsistence farming. And so who benefits from that is, you know, industrial farmers, or, countries are able to export all of, you know, cheaply produced food, right? So if they're subsidized by their governments to produce that food, it creates that imbalance. And so we know that even though that there's these pressures for more trade liberalization to protect intellectual property in predominantly the global south, that it's not going to accrue benefits to these populations. And with that, thinking about all of these markets as themselves gendered, right? That there are unequal benefits in that context as well. Another thing that's often adopted in the corporate food system is, you know, new technologies, right? So if we can introduce new technologies, perhaps we get women access to new technologies, that they'll increase productivity and they can participate in the global food system. But it's really important to think about these new technologies, again, as we've already talked about, genetically modified foods, the threats to biodiversity that come with that. Those have gendered effects as well. As again, if we think about the cases of women who are familiar with agroecological practices, practices that protect biodiversity, that these agricultural biotechnologies are a threat to biodiversity, even if they're not being used by those farmers themselves, right? If they're being used adjacent to those crops, that they can be a threat, whether it's new seed or herbicide or pesticide use. And again, even though it's often suggested that farmers are the beneficiaries of those new technologies, we're seeing that power and the benefits accrue to corporate actors. There's increasing corporate concentration in this sector, so that we have fewer producers of genetically modified seeds and the herbicides and pesticides that go with them. There's less competition, the prices go up. So even those who are adopting them are, they become reliant on them, and those prices go up and the power tends to accrue to them. And of course, that's happening at the same time as a climate crisis, right? So how are those seeds able to adapt to a changing climate? And what do they push out? So does it take away, you know, weeds that might otherwise be resources that people use as foodstuffs, that, you know, corporate scientists are not necessarily thinking about that. What labor, you know, whose labor does it relieve is another question. Are there new risks? If we're thinking about new technologies and types of equipment that's being used, is it thinking about different bodies that use it? So we have different sizes of bodies. That's a gendered question. People have different abilities, as we're thinking about there. But also, like, are they culturally and ecologically appropriate? Are they long-term solutions to the climate crisis, like the existential threat that we're facing? And so thinking about the kinds of technologies that communities need and want is a very different question than the kinds of technologies that are often offered as a solution to things like gender equality. Another thing that we see often suggested through the corporate food system is, you know, empowerment and economic empowerment. And I think it's really important to question that. And I know that a number of the people who are on this panel and organizations involved are very strongly critique the idea of economic empowerment without thinking about the bigger political and economic questions that are going on. So why we talk about empowerment instead of women's rights? I think that's a really important question, and not just women's rights, peasants' rights, Indigenous people's rights, the rights of LGBTQ people. You know, all of this needs to be considered as well. And so when we think about empowerment and when we use empowerment, I think who benefits are people who benefit from the status quo, because that language is often a compromise. It can mean anything and it can mean nothing. And I think it's really important to draw that in comparison to the question of women's rights or the rights of people broadly, which requires governments to do something, right? To fulfill your obligations to rights often means you have to do something. Economic empowerment can mean any number of things. And so you don't see, you know, that commitment to rights. And we've seen that within institutions like the Committee for World Food Security itself. And economic empowerment, when we focus on that, tends not to focus on the bigger questions that we need to think about, like gender-based violence and rates of domestic violence and femicide, the threats to environmental and human rights defenders. These are fundamental human rights that need to be protected here. It also doesn't challenge the broader culture of cultures of misogyny and sexism that preclude women from being more active in communities and traditional modes of participation. And that's why I think it's really important when we're looking at feminist economic alternatives is to think about all these other ways that women participate in communities, in decision making, in forums that haven't typically been privileged by the corporate food system. And so who benefits from the empowerment language? I would argue it tends not to be women. It tends to be, you know, the patriarchal institutions, people who are already in positions of authority, whether that's formal or informal, and, you know, governments that don't want to meet international human rights obligations. It doesn't like, it benefits them. And that's why I think feminist economic alternatives are so important to think about in terms of who benefits, because I think on the face of it, people might think, oh, it's women who benefit from feminist economic alternatives, but it is everybody. And I think that this is fundamental, like feminism broadly, I mean, to quote Bell Hooks, feminism is for everyone. And I think feminism economic alternatives are also for everybody. It recognizes the role of care in our economies and our societies that could benefit from that. So they, you know, not just the care work that women do, but the importance of that care for how economies function and care for people, but also the environment, ecological resources, the long-term, you know, place of our communities on the planet. Recognizing that care and what it needs to support care means more demands on our governments to to provide support, social supports. Think about the distribution of resources differently. Think about taxation differently. And it can mean, you know, thinking about what it means to be able to provide care for our communities means, I think, food sovereignty and protection of food resources, recognizing equal land rights in practice, not just on paper, you know, more cooperation, more, you know, more participation from more diverse groups of people. And I think that that's what's truly radical and could create, you know, an economic alternative to the food systems that we have. And so we need, and again, I'm glad to I'll pull it back to where we started, where I think it was Ruth who said off the top that you're thinking about the context, thinking about the local context specific needs of different agroecological food systems and the people in them, is where you need to start to think about how we feed and sustain communities going forward, and to build a bottom-up alternative to corporate food systems as we see them. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. You've said so much, made really important points, and I think, you know, it is important for us to sort of look at things through the lens of who benefits. I think that's an important lens to use, whether that's around, you know, who's benefiting from trade policy and systems, which Nyambura had kind of sort of elaborated a lot about earlier, including, you know, intellectual property regimes like TRIPS and others who benefit from that. It's industrial farmers. It's not local smallholder farmers who benefits from new technologies, whose needs to those technologies respond to, again, not, you know, local smallholder farmers. And I think also, yeah, you know, your critique of you know, women's economic empowerment programs and language and so on, and who benefits from that kind of empowerment language, I think is important. You know, adding, you know, the Add Women and Stir kind of approach, you know, to addressing gender inequalities, you know, using a system that has failed, you know, thinking that adding women to a failed system will somehow miraculously solve gender inequalities. And this goes back to what everybody, Sonia, Miriam, Nyambura have talked about in terms of needing sort of this structural transformation, and, you know, completely rejecting the models that continue to fail us, including capitalism. So thanks so much for that. Thanks to all of you. I have seen a few, we have about 15 minutes to go. There are a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A section, which Miriam has responded to. Miriam has responded to 2 of those. And I will give Miriam, I'll give you a chance to speak to them. Even if you've given a written response, it would be good to hear a little bit more from you. And one of the questions was around, you know, this came from Richard, asking how can we reframe capitalist valorization of work that leads to the accumulation of wealth and exploitative competition between individuals. And he had asked for specific examples around how to sort of frame alternative economic practices from your experience, Miriam, and you did respond to that, but I'll give you a chance to respond to all of us in a second. And there's a second question around, women, you know, are women being forced to subsidize failed, corrupt, extractive, patriarchal states through localized food production? And related to that, does urban farming reinforce capitalism, you know, by filling responsibilities that the welfare state should take for citizens? So I'll ask Miriam to respond to that. And after you, Miriam, I'll bring Nyambura back, perhaps to share some of the thoughts that she didn't have a chance to finish reflecting on earlier, and then we'll see where we are in time. But certainly I would give Sonia and Andrea a chance as well to say, you know, to make a few remarks in closing. So over to you, Miriam.
Bien, dos cosas. Una, sobre el debate del valor, que hay 2 niveles. Uno que nos preocupa mucho es el tema del tiempo. porque, bien, haciendo el cálculo del valor con el tiempo socialmente necesario, tenemos como medida el tiempo reloj de las estructuras capitalistas de producción. Y entonces lo que estamos intentando entender es cómo son las otras temporalidades en el medio rural, los tiempos de los cuidados y los tiempos de la naturaleza. Entonces, tal vez incluso repensar que la idea de valor funciona muy bien para explicar el sistema capitalista, maravillosa, pero para pensar en nuestras alternativas de organización y económica, tal vez tendríamos que pensar también desde otras miradas. Y el otro tema que era si la agricultura urbana estaría un poco sirviendo como un amortecimiento del capital. Yo quería les dar un ejemplo. Una cosa que, claro, eso vale para todo. Si nuestras iniciativas funcionan como amortecimiento y siempre el combate que estamos haciendo al maquillaje lila que hacen las corporaciones transnacionales y los intentos de cooptación. Pero quería dar solo un ejemplo, es que cuando desde donde yo estoy actuando más localmente, sentimos como este proceso de solidaridad ha fortalecido mucho, solidaridad que yo digo, el aumento del acceso de las poblaciones periféricas al alimento agroecológico. Romper con esta idea de que el alimento agroecológico solo lo accesan la gente que tiene plata o los trabajadores estables que tienen un salario y pueden comprometerse ante la acción que van a comprar el alimento. Entonces, ¿cómo organizar eso? Porque de un lado, las campesinas, las agricultoras necesitan saber quién va a comprar para recolectar lo que van a comprar, y del otro lado de la ciudad, la gente trabajadora tiene una estabilidad muy grande. Un día yo sé que tengo esta plata, otro día ya no sé más. Entonces, ¿cómo juntar eso? Todo el tema de la solidaridad está nos dando muchas ideas, muchos insights. Y cuando nos juntamos para evaluar eso y pensar cómo sostener esta alianza a lo largo del tiempo, juntos a nosotras una organización del movimiento de personas negras acá de Brasil, la UNEAFRO, que es un movimiento que se organizó para aumentar el acceso de las personas negras y periféricas a las universidades, con el tema de la educación. Y que ellas percibieran que estaban siempre haciendo movilizaciones en contra de los grandes supermercados, como es la red Carrefour, acá en Brasil, que siempre están humillando, incluso matando a personas negras en esos supermercados. Entonces, ¿qué percibieron? Que estábamos nos movilizando en contra de estos supermercados, y en las periferias muchas veces se destruía el comercio local y la gente tenía que poner los pies en los mismos supermercados que las humillan. Entonces se propusieron a organizar el acceso de la gente al alimento, a las necesidades básicas de otra manera. Eso es un ejemplo que quiero decir, que va en el sentido de liberar los territorios de este control. Entonces ellos, incluso haciendo los huertos urbanos, van en ese sentido de romper a la lógica del capital. Y claro, todo eso va con una intencionalidad política muy fuerte de, desde hoy, ya ir plantando otras formas de organización y de sociabilidad en las cuales el cuidado también está en el centro, como una persona había comentado. Gracias.
Thank you, Miriam. Just before you come in, Nyambura, yeah, I can see Andrea is responding to one of the other questions around how we build in care into our societies. Ensuring that we're still taking care of exploitation and people taking advantage of women's labor. And I don't know, Nyambura, if you wanted to, or any of the other panelists wanted to respond to the question around the impact of agricultural toxins on reproductive health. That's another question that has come in from Vanessa in the chat. But over to you, Nyambura, and then I will ask Sonia to come in with any reflections on the questions or any final thoughts. And finally, Andrea, with final reflections as well. And then we will have to close.
Okay, so just before that, I wanted to answer one of the questions that's been asked about the state and urban farming just before my conclusion is very quick. I think that's a very important question. And I think that we don't spend enough time thinking about power and thinking about the state. So I would look at it this way. Urban farming, for sure, in the absence of a strong welfare state, almost every single thing that we do is basically subsidizing the state. When it comes to taking care of those who are sick, which falls on women, obviously, or young girls, to take care of those who are sick, in the absence of public, affordable health systems, or when it comes to, the educational support that, after school educational support that, women often have to take in the absence of good public education system, there's always an argument of subsidizing the state. But there's also one thing that I always sit and think about and also warn about, and this is thinking that has grown out of thinking with Joy James, who talks about the architecture of abolition, and not abolition just in the context of abolish the police or abolish the military, but thinking of a world in which we have abolished the structures of oppression. It's not enough to talk about, and I love what La Via Campesina does. It's not just about technical or policy solutions. What we are fighting about is political power at the end of the day. Agroecology may be the technical project, but food sovereignty is the political project, because anyone can claim to do agroecology. Anyone. Monsanto can walk in here, or Bio-Syngenta, and say that we're doing agroecology on large scale industrial ways. But that's not what food sovereignty is. That's not what our political project is. The political project is to transform the society. I think about the decolonization, and Fanon talks about that decolonization is the making of new men and women and everybody and human beings. This is what our political project is. And we should have a political project in which you really think about what the state is, how do we handle the state? Because even welfare countries, Scandinavian welfare countries, these are not socialist countries, these are not anti-capitalist countries. And the wealth of Scandinavian countries still comes from the exploitation of the global south. So in the larger scheme of things, I do not think that even that is an aspiration for us, for those of us who believe that we need to live in a world where everybody is free, not the wealth of others becoming the exploitation of others, again, going back to Fanon's work. So it's important to think about state power. It is true that everything that we do in the absence of a strong public state is subsidizing the state, but at the same time, we have been farming, we have been caring for one another since time immemorial. This is not new to us. So we have to really reconceptualize our ideas of what care is, going beyond the care that we're forced to do in a capitalist world, in a patriarchal world, but to transform care into something that all of us, men, women, whoever you identify, whoever you are, that this is something that we all participate in as a society, not for the exploitation or benefit of one or two people, but because of the radical remaking of society. So that would be my answer to that. And I guess maybe the answer around what we eat, and question of reproductive systems. I will not go deep into that because I am not a scientist, but my own reading, my own engagement with scientists, comrades, allies within the particular movement that we're in, we definitely know that there are links to our health, increased levels of cancers with the kinds of chemicals that we're using. One of the things that we say is that the name escapes me now, but one of the when you look at the pesticide industries or the chemical fertilizers, they were actually used in the World War II and when the US invaded Vietnam. So even the chemicals that are used in agriculture have a very, very sinister history, that they were first used in colonial occupations. Right? So they were first used in one form of colonial occupation. And once these wars were over, these industries had to transform themselves. But when you go deep into the histories of this particular agricultural, industrial agricultural companies, you find that this particular links of occupation, colonization, and what we have right now, the kinds of agricultural systems that we have linked with each other. One of the things that we do know is, this is one of the things that I've worked on actually, is that for the longest time, and this unfortunately still continues on the continent, and this is not just about industrial agricultural chemicals, but even when it comes to contraceptives, we do know that all these companies in the global north, including Western governments, regularly donate expired or nearly expired contraceptives to the global south, but even donate, birth control and chemicals that they do not even use, that are prohibited from being used in their own countries, but regularly get dumped in the global south. So the question has its merits. That's as far as I will go. There's already literature around that. I'd be very happy to send it to friends at ActionAid to share with anyone on this. So, but finally for me, one of the things that I wanted to, in my own conclusion around this work, I loved what was said in the end, that feminism is for everyone, as Bell Hooks say. But I'll go forward and say that further than Bell Hooks, if I may, who's a wonderful, feminist, goddess for me, I'll go further and say that feminism is for everyone. And, but feminism should not mean everything and anything to anyone. It's really important. A feminism that is not anti-imperialist, a feminism that is pro-capitalist, a feminism that is just like add and star, put everything you want to put. I'll say Mashakura, the Kenyans in the room will understand what I'm saying. A feminism where anything goes is not a feminism worth its salt. We have to get what our feminism is, the minimum non-negotiables are. There are feminisms, not even feminism. I speak of feminism's language, but even within the body of feminisms, we must have some minimum non-negotiables. Feminisms that are allied to power, patriarchal power, homophobic power, transphobic power, state power in the most violent and virulent ways, have no business being called feminisms. So we must guard against this so-called this feminisms that nobody seems to really know what they mean. But at the same time, we must recover politics of transnational feminist solidarities. And I'm so happy that we have Lavia, I'm represented from La Via Campesina, World March of Women, and all of us in this particular space. Remembering that the fights that we face, the same companies that pollute our waters, our soil, the earth, the air, are the same companies in collusion with repressive and oppressive governments. When we look at the whole infrastructure of oppression and marginalization, the same actors, hold this structure together. So we must remember that whatever fights we are facing around food sovereignty, around, climate justice, we have to think about transnational feminist solidarity. We must also work thinking about cross-movement organizing. We need unions, we need the queer movement, we need the trans movement, we need every single movement, workers' movements, health movements, whichever movements they are. This is not a fight we win by ourselves. We must recover the principles of, working together across movements, across different categories. I mean, as Audre Lorde says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Nyambura, for responding to those, but also for your powerful challenge to us around our feminisms and what that feminisms can't be. It's for everyone, but is not everything. But also, the importance of cross-movement, building solidarity and so on. So thanks for those really powerful remarks in closing. We are at time, we're actually a minute over time. I want to give a chance to Sonia and Andrea just in 1 minute, please, in 1 minute, because I know that there are several attendees that need to join the next sessions. So a minute each just for some final thoughts.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Como pensamiento final, yo creo que ha quedado claro que solas no podemos continuar esta lucha, con lo cual desde Vía Campesina Internacional animamos a todas a crear estas alianzas tan necesarias tanto para el empoderamiento de la mujer como para implementar el feminismo. El feminismo, como lo decía la compañera, no es todo, pero sí que es un inicio y un comienzo. Y debemos apoyar a nuestras mujeres, a nuestros colectivos más vulnerables, para que estas personas puedan estar en altas instituciones donde realmente se están tomando las decisiones de cómo tenemos que vivir y qué tenemos que comer. Entonces necesitamos esas alianzas conjuntas de todas y de todes para poder seguir luchando contra este capitalismo que nos está diciendo lo que comemos, cómo tenemos que vivir y cómo tenemos que producir, cuando realmente debemos hacer todo lo contrario para poder tener un modo de vida saludable y poder vivir de nuestras producciones sanas, basadas en la soberanía alimentaria. Debemos conocer a los productores y productoras a nuestro alrededor para poder hacer esas compras de kilómetro cero y tan importantes que son para la agricultura en general. Muchas gracias por este seminario. Gracias.
Yeah, I just very quickly also want to reiterate what Nyambura said about knowing what feminism means, and not letting that get watered down by often more powerful actors, social, like economically and politically more powerful actors, and to reiterate also what Sonia just said about the importance of alliances and solidarities, and making sure that the people who are most affected by what is going on are part of these conversations and the decision making that is happening. And I think that what we're seeing, what's happening right now with the Food System Summit and the shift towards multi-stakeholderism instead of multilateralism, I think is something we should be concerned about, to connect it back to what's happening right now and to make sure that people are part of the conversation. So I'll end it there and just say thank you to everybody for a really excellent panel.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And I agree, it really, really was an excellent panel. And a lot of the attendees agree as well, from what I can see in the chat and what I've seen coming out on Twitter. So I really wanted to not take too long doing a long goodbye, but just to say thanks to everyone, first of all, who has joined and interacted with us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. Thank you also for the interaction through chat and so on. A huge thanks, of course. I can't thank enough our incredible panel today, Nyambura, Miriam, Sonia, Andrea. Thank you so much for all your powerful remarks and insights. Thanks to the ActionAid team and partners for organizing this, Alberta Guerra, Julie Middleton, Catherine Gatundu, and everybody else involved. I probably can't name everyone. Thanks also to our interpreters who have helped us all understand each other, Aziza, Margot, and Elena. And finally, just power and solidarity to you all, and have a great week of feminist mobilizing to transform corporate food systems to food systems for the people, which is why we're here today and this week. And indeed, no revolution without food, and no food without a revolution. A luta continua, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you, gracias. Thank you, Wangari.
Thank you, everybody.
Good work.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.